Let me read a review of an article in Nature to you.
To some of you it's familiar, but it's a good place to start. It's called How Evolution Kept Frogs a Jump Ahead. It says the remains of the oldest frog ever found show that it evolved jumping legs to avoid being eaten by dinosaurs, it was claimed today. The extinct frog, 4 specimens of which have been found on a Navajo Indian reservation in Arizona, had a skeleton very similar to modern species, reports Nature. By the way, for those of you who don't subscribe to Nature, it is basically the world's second most prestigious scientific magazine, and they would dispute that they were the best. But it's pretty well up the top. Quote unquote, these fossils show that the body plan of the frog has remained almost unchanged over the last 190 million years, so it appears to be very successful, says Professor Neil Shubin of the University of Pennsylvania. That's an interesting article because I wonder if that's the evidence for creation. It's entitled How Evolution Kept Frogs a Jump Ahead. It is an interesting theory, don't you think? I mean, these fossils show the body plan of the frog has remained almost unchanged over the past 190 million years. And in fact, the professor says,
all this evidence shows that frogs evolved jumping legs to avoid being eaten by dinosaurs. Think about that for a moment.
Catch how old that fossil frog was supposed to be. 190 million years.
It was easy to recognize as a fossil frog, the professor said. I've got a fossil frog right here in front of me, by the way. They are easy to recognize.
They just look like a frog that's crossed the interstate or the motorway underneath a semi-trailer. They're not difficult to recognise at all. In fact, that's what Professor Neil Shubin says. These fossils show the body plan of the frog has remained almost unchanged. And yet he's headed his article, Evolution. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? And yet the first frog, the oldest frog, the way did you catch this frog that I had here used to be the oldest frog. Now he's got the oldest frog. What he means by that is as you dig down through the rocks, first of all you come across the frogs that are hopping around this university campus. That's the present. Then you get into the rocks and these are the fossil ones. Then as you're going down the Grand Canyon,
you get to a spot, because you see this reservation is not far from the Grand Canyon. I've been to this reservation collecting dinosaur specimens.
You finally get to what looks like a frog that's crossed the interstate and interacted with a semi-trailer. And there it is in the rocks. Underneath that, there are no more things that look like frogs. So by definition, that's the oldest frog, the deepest one in the rocks. Am I making sense? That's where he gets his definition from.
This frog's supposed to be how old? 190 million years. It's an old frog. Looks pretty much the same as the ones today. Back to the question.
Is that the evidence for evolution, or is it the evidence for creation? And how would you tell the difference? I mean, I've got a book here, and reading from Genesis, the first chapter in the Bible, it talks about frogs.
And it says here in verse 21, and God created great whales and every living creature that moves, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind.
Now, I meet many people who say the evidence is overwhelming in favour of evolution. And I always like to ask them a simple little question: what evidence would be the proof of creation? 99% of them have no idea.
So I've got a good question for you. I wonder if the article about frogs is actually the evidence frogs were created.
In case you think that's an isolated example, let me quote to you from Professor Niles Eldredge, his book Reinventing Darwin in 1995. He's got a comment on the whole fossil record. Fossils, of course, are the remains of the creatures, plants, animals, preserved in some way in the rocks. Here's Niles Eldredge. No wonder paleontologists shied away from evolution for so long. It never seems to happen. It's a very interesting thought, that. I mean, be honest. Have you seen anything evolve lately? Not even your baby brother has evolved, has he? It never seems to happen. Assiduous collecting up cliff faces yields zigzags, minor oscillations, and very occasional slight accumulation of change over millions of years, at a rate too slow to account for all the prodigious change that has occurred in evolutionary history. When we do see the introduction of evolutionary novelty, it usually shows up with a bang, and often with no firm evidence that the fossils
did not evolve elsewhere.
Just in case you have forgotten, let me remind you about frogs. The remains of the oldest frog, remember that? The one under which there are nothing that looks like a frog? It was found, it's supposed to be 190 million years old. See if you've been listening. How did Professor Neil Shubin know it was a frog? Looked like a frog. That's how I knew this was a fossil frog. Looks like a frog. Easy to recognise with no trouble whatsoever. Looks like a dead frog. And yet most people would say the fossils are the proof of evolution. So I've got a question that we're going to try and answer tonight. I wonder what the evidence for creation would actually look like.